have Professor Katy Hayward, Dr. Sean Bernard Newman, and Dr. Lisa Whitten. And of course, Sinn Féin's historic victory in Stormont on the 5th of May 2022 is a watershed in Northern Ireland's history, ending a century of unionist dominance. They won 29% of the preference vote and are now the biggest party in the Stormont Assembly. The surge in Sinn Féin's popularity can be ascribed to the fracturing of the unionist vote and the growing nationalist sentiment. What are the implications for the constitutional future of Northern Ireland? Sinn Féin's triumph triggered calls for a referendum on a united Ireland. Reunification is not a foregone conclusion, and most Northern Irish favour staying in the Union, but Sinn Féin hopes to change public opinion within 5 to 10 years. Anyway, Sinn Féin's victory in Northern Ireland raises questions about the future of the United Kingdom, and I leave it to our experts to enlighten us this morning.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sean Newman. And today I'm going to be providing, for this panel, some historical context, looking back in the longue durée to the Constitution and the Union, and looking at ideas of exceptionalism and precarity. It is said that in Ireland and Northern Ireland, history is not so much politicised as politics is historicised. Politics is defined by the past. In Ireland, little separates the two main parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, except one opposed the Anglo-Irish Treaty, while the other one supported it 101 years ago. That is more accented in Northern Ireland, where history defines community relations and political allegiances today. That same history creates exceptional and precarious constitutional arrangements in Northern Ireland, with an uneasy and ever-changing relationship with the uncodified constitution of the United Kingdom. This presentation, based on my paper published by the Constitutional Society last month, looks at Northern Ireland's constitutional history over the centuries, and the Union more generally, but also provides context for the current challenges Northern Ireland faces, from Brexit to India F2, from a Sinn Féin First Minister, and to a potential border poll. I argue that Northern Ireland's place in the molten constitution of the United Kingdom is exceptional and precarious, and that since partition, the union between Northern Ireland and Great Britain is vestigial, existing, but not for the purposes or in the way it was originally meant to. I explore this history through 5 main themes. Firstly, that English self-interest and English nationalism drove both the Anglo-Scots Union of 1707 and the British-Irish Union of 1800, and English nationalism continues to be a key factor in relations between the constituent states of the United Kingdom. Secondly, that British, but mainly English politicians involved themselves periodically in Irish and Northern Irish politics to prove their English nationalist and British unionist credentials to appeal to their constituents at home in England. Thirdly, English and British policymakers treat Northern Ireland as a constitutional exception, willing to innovate forms of self-government as well as suspend it. Fourthly, the willingness to innovate causes structural instability, as Northern Ireland's constitution is ever-changing, but also part of everyday political discourse there. Fifthly, I argue that the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community, the PUL, despite their name and earnest protestations, have been, and perhaps are and will always be, willing to resort to violence and the threat of violence to achieve their political objectives. So let's look at these themes through the historical lens and tease out some patterns in the development of this vestigial union. In 1603, James VI and First failed to unite his northern and southern realms into a united kingdom. James planned for a single constitutional entity of Great Britain joining Scotland, which he sometimes referred to as North Britain, and England, which he sometimes referred to as South Britain, as one. For James, the plan was personal and religious, with the first Stuart monarch of England and Scotland together telling the English Parliament, "What God hath conjoined, then let no man separate. I am husband, and the whole isle is my wife. I am the head, and it is my body. I hope, therefore, no man will be so unreasonable to think that I should be a polygamist and husband to 2 wives." But English self-interest was that unreasonable, and the Parliament and English courts denied James's constitutional project. Xenophobia played a key role in English refusals. Long memories of conflict between England and Scotland, a belief in English exceptionalism with ancient liberties, and prejudice that unaccountable waves of beggarly Scots would stream over the border in search of charity drove English protests. Although James proclaimed himself King of Great Britain and used the style on coinage and paraphernalia, his constitutional project collapsed despite considerable but far from universal support in Scotland in the face of English objections. This episode is useful to use as it demonstrates the crucial role of English xenophobia and nationalism in the historical nature of the Union, but also as simultaneously James accelerated the plantation and migration of Ulster as a project to create a distinctly Anglo-Scottish and for him therefore British population in the most unsettled part of his third kingdom. How attitudes shifted by 1707 when Queen Anne's government oversaw the successful Acts of Union of 1707 further tease out some of our themes. Anne's brother-in-law and cousin, William of Orange, stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, landed 40,000 troops in the southwest of England in the first phase of the successful Dutch invasion of 1688. William quickly conceded constitutional and ecclesiastical freedoms to Scotland, which led to 18 years of legislative independence north of the border, a legislative independence that sorely hurt English self-interest. Very briefly, Scottish legislative independence led to Scottish assertions of freedom in trade and foreign policy, particularly in relation with France during the War of the Spanish Succession. And that diverged and directly opposed English trade and foreign policy. Deterioration in Anglo-Scots relation coincided with the failure of the Darien scheme, which was Scotland's attempt at colonial imperialism, which bankrupted the Scottish realm. Anne's government feared French deployment or occupation in Scotland was a jumping-off point to invade England, as Scotland became a national security threat. In 1702, the Whig government decided union between England and Scotland neutralised the threat of national security, and also created, for them luckily, a big free trade area, and served the national interest where it had not done a century before. Bribery of Scottish parliamentarians, the offer to pay off the Darien scheme debt, and the promise of legal and ecclesiastical independence secured the Acts of Union in 1707. 93 years later, a period of Irish legislative independence and the threat of French deployment and occupation in the most westerly kingdom similarly drove English, by now British, designs for a British-Irish union. The importance of the British-Irish Acts of Union of 1800 is both in the similarity of its emergence with the Anglo-Scottish Union of 1707, but also that it is the remnants and basis of the vestigial union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland today, and that the history of its development and its contest define much of contemporary Northern Irish politics. In 1782, the British Parliament rescinded the Declaratory Act of 1719 that previously made Ireland a dependency of Great Britain. This constitution of 1782 followed a campaign for Irish autonomy in the wake of Britain's defeat against the United States and an increasingly assertive Irish volunteer movement which had sprung out of armed Irish home defence groups raised when regular British troops were deployed to North America. These concessions led to a period of legislative autonomy known as the Gratton Parliament, where Irish parliamentarians became increasingly assertive, with Westminster renouncing any future claim to legislate for Ireland, and where it removed some penalties against Irish Catholics. Despite representing an ascendancy Episcopalian landed class, the Parliament legislated independently and in its own interest, just as Scotland had done after the Dutch invasion and before the Acts of Union of 1707. However, Gratton's Parliament failed to achieve the parliamentary reforms pushed for by many of its radical members. In the context of the French Revolutionary Wars, the frustration of radical parliamentarians joined together with an increasingly sectarian frustration of the Catholic emancipation campaigners, which together formed a United Irish Society in 1791. In the 18th century, Anne's government's fears of French invasion via Scotland were not realised, but in December 1796, only a storm stopped 15,000 French troops landing in Ireland, but while in May 1798, a smaller French force did successfully land in County Mayo in support of the UIS and declared the Republic of Connaught. Although the rebellion was put down brutally, British fears of Ireland as the soft underbelly of national security were realised. Just as the Union answered England's national security challenge with Scotland, so it did again in Ireland in 1800. William Pitt the Younger set out proposals for a British-Irish union which went some way, in an early form of constructive unionism, to meeting the reformist and emancipationist demands of the UIS. However, change did not follow union. Pitt's ministry fell, and John Fitzgibbon, the Lord Clare, pushed for a hardline, anti-reform, anti-emancipationist programme in the new Addington ministry. George III, committed to protecting Protestant primacy, supported Clare. The British government once again considered Ireland a dependency and pursued a policy of remorseless Protestantism, which in turn led to the mass mobilisation of Irish Catholics under the leadership of Daniel O'Connell. While bribery held past the Acts of Union of 1707, it was the single most significant factor in 1800. Union between Ireland and Great Britain was not consensual, and with its dependency status, neither was it between two peer states. The character of the unions of 1707 and 1800 were fundamentally different. Despite this, supposed commonalities between the two sets of Acts of Union legitimised the other, with the alleged success of Anglo-Scottish Union used to buttress the British-Irish Union. Similarities did exist: a preceding period of legislative autonomy, acting contrary to English and British interest, a free trade area, and strengthening national security. However, where the Union of 1707 was a federative union that ensured Scottish legal and ecclesiastical independence and was contracted between England and Scotland as peer states, the Union of 1800 once again made Ireland a dependency of Great Britain, contracted not between peers, but between Great Britain and Ireland's unrepresentative ascendancy class. For the ascendancy, Union protected their privilege, while the vast majority of Ireland saw the Union as the ultimate break on their emancipation and any further political reform. That remained the case until the Irish Revolution, over a century later. Time means I have to leap over the rest of the 19th century, but I'm happy to take questions, although I'm not an expert on Irish Victorian nationalism. But from this period, let us distill from those decades this point. Irish nationalism became a mass movement with near hegemonic support outside the province of Ulster and the university seats in Dublin. It became defined by cultural and romantic ideas of nationalism and split between moral force and physical force, between parliamentary nationalism and violent Fenianism. Parliamentary nationalism, coupled with land reform, enjoyed something just short of universal support among the majority Catholic population, while Fenianism remained a marginal group on the fringes of Irish political extremism until after the Easter Rising in 1916. By 1886, minority Liberal ministries depended on the Irish Parliamentary Party for confidence and supply, and in return offered votes on Home Rule. The first Home Rule Bill fell in the Commons in 1886, with the second bill passing the Lower House in 1893, only to be blocked by the Lords. Outside of Ulster, ascendancy unionism withered on the vine. Irish unionism became Ulster unionism, a cross-class movement based almost entirely in Ulster. The Irish question became central question to British politics, and the Irish question, by 1910, became the Ulster question. So here, and quickly, we look at the period of the Orange agitation, which led to partition, the foundation of the state of Northern Ireland, in which contemporary Northern Irish politics is played out, with various constitutional changes and innovations in the centuries in between that Katy and Lisa will ably explore next. Let me remind you of those 5 themes that sit under the headlines of constitutional exceptionism and constitutional precarity. Firstly, English self-interest and English nationalism are crucial in forming the unions. Secondly, British, but mainly English politicians politicise the unions and periodically demonstrate a willingness to involve themselves in Irish and Northern Irish politics and involve Ireland and Northern Ireland in British politics to appeal to their home constituency. Thirdly, English and British policymakers treat Northern Ireland as a constitutional exception with a willingness to innovate forms of and suspend self-government there. Fourthly, Northern Ireland's constitutional exceptionalism causes structural precarity as Northern Ireland's constitutional status is changeable and a feature of its regular political discourse. Finally, and fifthly, the Protestant Unionist loyalist PUL community are, despite the eponymous professions of loyalism and unionism, willing to resort to the threat and actual use of physical force and extra-constitutional action to secure their political ends. Up to this point, along with the 17th century plantation settlement of Ulster creating an exceptional ethno-cultural mixture in the province and the use of Protestant self-defence banding in the 1640s to use physical force as a means to achieve their objectives. The Anglo-Scottish Union and British unions, British-Irish unions, demonstrate the centrality of English and British self-interest in pursuing the schemes of union. From periods of legislative freedom acting against English and British interests respectively, the threat of French invasion from Scotland and then Ireland, compromising national security, and the pursuit of free trade, unions came about when it suited English and British self-interest. The period of the Orange agitation, which is also known as the Ulster Crisis, demonstrates the politicisation of Ireland by British politicians, as well as Northern Ireland's constitutional exceptionalism and innovation. From 1910, Ulsterians, a shorthand term for the incongruous term Protestant Unionist Loyalist community, formed a distinctive Ulsterian ethno-cultural national identity. Perhaps it was in response to the increasingly chauvinistic Irish nationalism emerging from the Catholic, cultural and romantic national front of organisations such as the Gaelic League and the Gaelic Athletic Association, or perhaps it was a means for Ulsterians to reassert their economic, social and political ascendancy in Ulster. Ulsterians mobilised to prevent, by any means necessary, the implementation of Home Rule in the 9 counties. The Liberal government passed the Parliament Act of 1910 ostensibly to pass the People's Budget, but also at the behest of the Irish Parliamentary Party to sidestep the Lords and their veto of the Home Rule. By 1911, Ulsterians formed the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF, which numbered 110,000 by 1914, armed with 25,000 rifles and over 1 million rounds of ammunition. Ulster was at fever pitch, and British Conservatives played the orange card, a term first used by Randolph Churchill in the 1880s, to vocally offer Ulsterians full support in any action they took to resist Home Rule, but more importantly, to puff up their imperialist and unionist credentials with their English constituents, and to procure a crisis to cripple and bring down the Liberal government. In parallels with the Northern Ireland Protocol and riding roughshod over troubled legacy agreements today, Conservatives postured on Ulster for their political benefit with little or no regard to the consequences in the province. Ulsterians' revolutionary and rebellious behaviour, forming an Ulster provisional government, gun-running illegal arms from Germany, paraded and conducted war games to such an extent that the Attorney General for Ireland even prepared treason charges against them, was not a bluff. I argue the threat of violence and physical force was real and received popular support and used by Ulsterians to secure their political objectives. To avoid a bloody civil war, only really prevented by Germany's invasion of Belgium, British policymakers considered innovative constitutional arrangements that ultimately led to partition, an outcome neither nationalist Republicans or Ulsterians wanted. The period saw dual monarchy on the Austro-Hungarian model proposed, 9-county, 6-county and 4-county partition proposed, partition based on poor law union boundaries, plebiscites by county, an all-island Senate with a separate House of Commons for Ulster and a 3-province House of Commons, an all-island parliament with 40% of the seats reserved for Protestants, an all-island parliament with local government in Belfast, to mention just a few. In the end, British self-interest modelled through 6-county partition with the promise of a boundary commission to revise the border and a Council of Ireland to lay the groundwork for an all-island government. Britain's imperative was to extract itself from Ireland and the quagmire there, and to redeploy its forces across the empire to confront anti-colonial movements and to British cities to put down industrial unrest. The result was Northern Ireland, a sectarian state with sectarian policing, sectarian local government, sectarian electoral boundaries, sectarian security law, and sectarian social and economic policies. Only direct rule in response to the breakdown of law and order removed the outwardly sectarian nature of government in Northern Ireland. So to conclude, throughout history, Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom's molten constitution has been exceptional and precarious. English and British self-interest, politicisation of Irish and Ulster issues by British politicians, exceptional and innovative forms of government, the use of that exceptional and precariousness in everyday political discourse, and the threat and use of violence by Ulsterians has determined Ireland and Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom's constitutional arrangements and continue to do so to this day. By 1920, that contested history created Northern Ireland, whose constitutional present remains as contested now as it did ever. Thank you.
Although we only truly discussed the content of our presentations over breakfast this morning, this one is actually going to build quite directly on what Sean has just eloquently outlined in terms of history. And I may also do a bit of a Chris Whitty impression in terms of slides, because Alex is kindly going to flick through that for me. So in the next few minutes, I want to make the case that one of the key impacts of the process of UK withdrawal from the EU, Brexit, has had on Northern Ireland has been to change its position from being a frontier place in terms of the Constitution to being a fulcrum place in constitutional terms. Further, I'm going to endeavour to convince you all that the current challenges in and over Northern Ireland and its unique post-Brexit arrangements, arising primarily from the Protocol in Ireland and Northern Ireland, can usefully be understood as the outworking of tensions that exist between two different constitutional traditions and approaches to managing constitutional development, that stemming from the UK and the archetypal British traditions that lean towards political constitutionalism, and that from the EU stemming from the more legal constitutionalist orientation of the European integration project, the idea of the European community as a community of law, etc. And with post-Brexit Northern Ireland now playing this kind of fulcrum role as a point of connection and therefore contestation between the two. Before going any further, I want to put out a quick disclaimer. It's always risky to use phrases like political or legal constitutionalisms or contrast British constitutional tradition versus European constitutional tradition in a short presentation and to a room of very learned individuals. So I would ask for grace as I give very hasty treatment to what are weighty areas of scholarship and history. More than happy to go into detail over questions and answers or coffee even. In terms of structure, I'm going to say something quite briefly, but just to contextualise conversation about history and theory. And then essentially I want to set up a contrast between pre-Brexit approaches to managing political conflict and constitutional development in Northern Ireland and post-Brexit contemporary approaches and arrangements, kind of architecture for managing political conflict and potential constitutional development in Northern Ireland, and then conclude by hopefully bringing it all together and returning to the idea of Northern Ireland as this point of connection and contestation and how that's working itself out today. Slide please, Alex, thanks. So these three texts on the slide are intended to demonstrate and symbolise part of what Sean was highlighting in terms of constitutional exceptionalism, that Northern Ireland has long been a unique constitutional place in the UK context, and second, that it has generally been treated as an exception, as Sean outlined, a place apart, a frontier place, if you will, where things are different, but those differences in constitutional terms do not or have not tended to have a bearing on dominant ideas about or understandings of the UK Constitution. A lot can be said here, but in brief, you can kind of trace the development of scholarship and early works on the Constitution of the UK that first focused primarily on the English Constitution and then progressed to the more inclusive British Constitution. But in that rarely were arrangements in first Ireland and then Northern Ireland integrated into the discussion. And that also meant that the Northern Ireland case was not often considered or factored into some of the broader debates about, for example, the extent to which the UK Constitution is, was, or ought to be political or considered political rather than legal in nature. By way of incomplete demonstration, when Northern Ireland was established in 1920, it became the UK's first experiment in devolution, but it's not often that you find it framed as such, even in contemporary textbooks and discussions that imagine 1998 as the year that the unitary state of the UK got a bit more complicated by introducing devolved arrangements. Also interesting and linked to the images on my left to your right, the nice pink, is that in the period between 1920 to 1972, thereabouts, a specific strand of literature and body of literature developed on the Northern Ireland Constitution, which that phrase tended to be a reference to the 1920 Government of Ireland Act. And that's interesting in itself because a key tenet of classically understood British constitutionalism is that it's uncodified in nature. But in Northern Ireland, even from 1920 to 72, it had this statute that was framed as a constitution and discussed as such, albeit sitting in the broader context of the UK state and constitutional laws and norms. skipping casually through about 70 years of history. Since 1998, arrangements for government in Northern Ireland have operated according to the provisions and principles of the 1998 Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Most of its provisions, the agreement, have been implemented in UK law by one constitutional text, the 1998 Northern Ireland Act, which incidentally has also been recognised as to serve in effect as a constitution for Northern Ireland. Post-1998 analyses of the UK constitution arguably have tended to overlook or underplay the specific significance of the 1998 agreement or its novelty in the UK setting as an international treaty that's underpinned by the exercise of popular consent on the part of the citizenry of both Northern Ireland and Ireland, and the contents of the 1998 agreement, the contents of which are largely transposed into one codified piece of constitutional legislation, the 1998 Northern Ireland Act, recognised in the UK courts to serve in effect as a constitution. The 1998 agreement and its implementation in Northern Ireland challenges or kind of pulls at some of the key principles and what's understood as the fundamental principle of the UK constitution, namely parliamentary sovereignty. While the UK Parliament retains sovereignty over devolved institutions in Northern Ireland, that's clear in law, but the origins of the 1998 agreement and the 1998 Northern Ireland Act, its status and the relationship between the two sit awkwardly with the idea that the UK Parliament could unmake either. All of which is just to suggest that Northern Ireland has remained a constitutionally exceptional and accepted place, with this kind of frontier status posture towards it being quite consistent through history, and it's been kind of distanced from central developments and central understandings of the UK Constitution. A final point in terms of context is just to underline the unique approach to constitutional development and the means for managing the implementation of the 1998 agreement. Slide, could you hop through 2 slides? Thank you. There we go. Suffice to say, the implementation of the 1998 agreement has not been easy. In the 24 years since it was signed, the institutions for devolved government in Northern Ireland have been inactive for approximately 37% of the time. That percentage is growing incrementally as we speak. This slide captures 2 of the longest periods of suspension, but it's not exhaustive in what it depicts in terms of the challenges. Leaving aside the unfortunate implications of institutional instability on Northern Ireland society and the quality of government that it enjoys, the way that instability in Northern Ireland has been managed, I think, is worth highlighting in the context of this conversation. The 1998 agreement did not set out any formal mechanism or procedure for dispute resolution. When disputes have arisen and institutions have collapsed, what we see is essentially a repeat of the long process that led to the agreement itself, meaning inter-party talks between parties in Northern Ireland, overseen by British and Irish governments, working jointly and on the basis of consensus, at least pre-2016. And sometimes that's featured independent brokers, usually from the US. As a result, we have a series of successor agreements, as they're termed, which are political texts that represent new agreement between political parties in Northern Ireland, overseen by British Irish governments, and those are often implemented or partially implemented in domestic law as need. The reason for highlighting this is this thread of constitutional development in Northern Ireland is unique in the UK context and arguably quite unique internationally for a sub-state region to consistently have this sort of profile. It's also something of a blend, I would suggest, between political constitutionalist approaches, with political talks between political actors being paramount, and a legal constitutional understanding or approach with black letter texts always being among the outputs of these sorts of processes. Although it's important to say that the successor agreements are themselves more political than legal documents. But I would suggest on the basis of that the process, the process for managing Northern Ireland issues post-1998 have taken more from a political constitutional playbook than it has from the legal constitutional playbook, because it's reliant on bilateral diplomacy, puts inter-party talks to the fore, and it's very negotiation-based, so it's all very political constitutionalist in flavour. Realise that's quite a lot of background, but the two key points so far are first that Northern Ireland has long been a constitutionally distinct place in the UK context, but second and crucially, this being so, it has also long been treated as an exception that does not or ought not to disrupt broader constitutional norms of the state. Enter Brexit. Agreed in its own terms, the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, is intended to address the unique circumstances on the island of Ireland in the context of UK withdrawal from the EU, to avoid a hard land border, to maintain necessary conditions for North-South cooperation on the island of Ireland, and to protect the 1998 agreement in all its parts. To do so, the protocol sets out novel arrangements for post-Brexit Northern Ireland that break with legal conventions in both the UK and the EU contexts. Under the terms of the protocol, Northern Ireland remains part of the UK customs territory, but is subject to the EU Customs Code, EU VAT rules, EU single market regulations for goods, EU state aid rules, and EU regulations relating to electricity supply and energy markets, because electricity supply is on an all-island basis. The protocol also guarantees no diminution in certain individual rights that are guaranteed in EU law, and enables Northern Ireland to remain a recipient of dedicated EU Peace Plus funding. A lot more can be said about the content of the protocol, but what I want to emphasise are the arrangements for its implementation and enforcement, and how these sit with pre-existing arrangements. Slide, please. So this is my attempt to make law colourful. This just sets out the extracts from the key texts and provisions of the UK-EU Withdrawal Agreement, the Protocol, and UK law, the key text, and the EU Withdrawal Act 2018 as amended, that read together, these provisions give the Protocol and the EU laws that it makes applicable to the UK in respect of Northern Ireland direct effect in Northern Ireland. Under the framework, the UK government is responsible for ensuring that the protocol and EU laws that it makes applicable are implemented in Northern Ireland. And there's a dedicated architecture of UK-EU bodies set up to oversee the implementation, and associated to those are agreed mechanisms for dispute resolution that are laid down. Again, I'm going to skim over the details and not go through the different layers of dispute resolution mechanism, but they exist. And looking at these arrangements for the implementation and enforcement of the protocol, in contrast to pre-Brexit arrangements for managing crises in Northern Ireland, and the still in process piece that it has. On the next slide is my attempt to set up the contrast and the difference. So the approach for managing recurring crises that there has been in Northern Ireland since 1998 has been primarily British-Irish diplomacy that has facilitated inter-party talks in Northern Ireland, and this is primarily a political dispute resolution mechanism or approach. The approach and the architecture for managing crises that arise relating to the implementation of the protocol have so far been UK-EU talks. There are dedicated bodies established for the purpose of managing UK-EU relationship and its the collective implementation of the protocol, although they haven't always been used in the current talks, but there are agreed procedures and mechanisms for dispute resolution laid down there. And this, the protocol system for managing the implementation of the protocol gives primacy to legal dispute resolution mechanisms. Next slide, please. So what I want to suggest is that the situation in Northern Ireland today, and this is the DUP leader, if you don't know, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, and a headline just from this week about the UK government's proposal to disapply some of the parts of the protocol. I think this situation, I would argue, comes at least in part from living in the tension of two approaches to and architectures for managing and settling disputes of a political, legal and constitutional nature in Northern Ireland. The DUP and their supporters are using well-established means of protest politics and institutional collapse in the hope of pressurising other players to compromise. This follows a post-1998 pattern in Northern Ireland politics. However, it kind of misses the realisation or doesn't recognise that the scenario here is different, quite fundamentally different. So the DUP and indeed at times the UK government approach reflect those strategies used to deal with Northern Ireland problems since 1998. But Northern Ireland is not anymore because of the architecture of the UK-EU relationship that now stands. It's no longer a frontier place. In this respect, the implementation of the protocol is currently and is likely to continue to be, because of the legal structures around it, at the core of post-Brexit UK-EU relations, broadly understood. And that's where this idea from frontier to fulcrum comes in. Last and final slide is my hasty attempt to crudely depict the post-Brexit position of Northern Ireland. I would suggest that today it can usefully be understood as the touching point, a place of connection, and therefore contestation, potentially, both within and between two legal orders and constitutional traditions of the UK and the EU. This is a non-conclusive conclusion. It's essentially a description. But I would underline that Northern Ireland as a place of crossover between these diverging constitutional approaches. One of the key impacts of Brexit has been that it has shifted from being a frontier place to being a fulcrum. And that fact means that what happens in Northern Ireland and the means for managing disputes and stability in Northern Ireland are going to continue to be important for those beyond its now infamous borders. With that, I'll finish and pass over to Katy. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to Sophie for organising this together with Andrew, and thanks to Alex for all the work behind the scenes. So I'm going to address the question this morning of whether there should be a border poll. And I'm doing this in light of the points that Sophie was making earlier around the significant success of Sinn Féin in the most recent Assembly election. And I do a wee bit of media on this, and I was fielding an awful lot of questions in advance of that election and certainly after it, expecting, or sort of wanting me to look at my watch and say when the border poll might be coming, when can we expect a united Ireland? So I thought it would be, in this particular setting, at this particular moment, it would be a good chance to have a look, to consider the grounds for calling a border poll, to look at the basis on which the Secretary of State might do that, and then to look at the evidence that we have at the moment with regards to the question of whether a majority exists in favour of Irish unification. Bearing in mind that the Constitution, the size and the future of two states lie in the hands of and will be decided by 687,049 people who are at the periphery, or at the frontier, as Lisa says, of those two states. And I come up with that figure because that's exactly half the size of Northern Ireland's electorate of 1.374 million plus one. So the means by getting a united Ireland is if you have a majority, so 50% plus one individual who votes in favour of Irish unification in a referendum. So I want to address two questions this morning. The first is, what are the grounds for Irish unification, and what are the grounds for assessing if it could occur? Next slide, please, Alex. So first and foremost, the provision for constitutional change. And I'm sure, not least because it's been in the news recently, that you may well be familiar with this, but just to have a particular look at what the law is with respect to Irish unification. Next slide, please, Alex. So the first point is, of course, the principle of self-determination. This was enormously important in the 1998 agreement. This is something that Irish nationalists have argued for such a long time, of course. What was different in the Good Friday Agreement is that it recognises two jurisdictions. So the people on the island of Ireland alone, without external impediment, including that from Britain, have the opportunity to exercise national self-determination, but something different comes in that Sinn Féin, Irish nationalists now, constitutional nationalists, recognise that the North is a legally significant jurisdiction. So there are 2 points I want to draw out from this. This is from the text itself. So one is that we're talking about a binary choice here. So it's not the case that Devo Max, so expanded version of devolution, for example, is on the table, or some federal option is on the table, really. Fundamentally, we're speaking about whether people in Northern Ireland continue to, as it has here, support the union with Great Britain or a sovereign united Ireland. It's either or. So hence you can understand then the significance of tensions as exist still between unionism and nationalism. It's a binary choice. The second point is the principle of majority consent, something we've heard an awful lot about recently. So it's for agreement between the two parts respectively, exercising self-determination on the basis of consent freely and concurrently given, so in principle 2 referendums. And then this right must be achieved and exercised with and subject to the agreement and consent of the majority of people in Northern Ireland. So, as I say, the majority within this very small region determine the future of Ireland and the United Kingdom. Next slide, please. Just on the responsibility of the British government minister in this regard. So, there's 2 elements here. The one is that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has the discretion to hold a border poll at any particular point if he wishes. But he is compelled to do so if it looks likely, and I'll read the text out because it's specific, must hold a referendum if at any time it appears likely to him, and it's written in that gendered language, that a majority of those voting would express a wish for a united Ireland. So it's that vague on which this is all founded. But it is important to note that he could call this referendum at any point for any purpose, but he is compelled to do so if it looks likely that a majority would wish for a united Ireland. So immediately, of course, this gives rise to the question of on what grounds would he make this decision. Next slide, please, Alex. And there was a case taken in 2018 by McCord, who sought to oblige the Secretary of State to set out a policy as to the circumstances in which the referendum would be ordered under these terms. The Secretary of State resisted. The case was heard by the Northern Ireland High Court and then by the Court of Appeal, but they both decided that the Secretary of State was under no obligation to publish in advance the grounds on which a decision would be made to order a referendum in Northern Ireland on this. Next, please. Sorry, just go back a wee bit. Thanks. So they noted in their assessment that there's a political judgment here. Of course, it's not something that can be separated from the political judgment. And they noted that we are talking about differing in unpredictable contexts and how in the context of Brexit. They also noted that the production of such criteria could be controversial, and it could lead to a situation in which either nationalists or unionists decide not to participate in power sharing if they object fundamentally to the criteria that the Secretary of State is using. Anyway, we're going to look at those now. Next, please, Alex. So the first point, assessing whether a majority exists. I included this picture. This is Sinn Féin, of course, and I just wanted us to note that a lot of the campaigning for Sinn Féin in this most recent Assembly election included a lot of promises, some of which were very grandiose and involved hundreds of millions of pounds, not on the side of a bus, but very much emblazoned on posters, etc., and slogans. And it was clear that in this referendum, in this election campaign, they were not focusing on a border poll; they were focusing on real-life issues. Next, please, Alex. I was part of a working group on Irish unification referendums that was convened by Alan Rennick in UCL We concluded our final report last year, and I'm just going to draw upon what we decided were the grounds on which such a border poll could be called, and covering all these different elements. Next, please. So qualitative evidence sounds quite unusual, but in the affidavit written on behalf of the Secretary of State in response to the McCord case, said that the Secretary of State could draw upon her contact with electoral political representatives and frequent engagement with members of the public, community groups and business organisations. It was a very unusual thing to say, and perhaps it was trying to reassure people that the Secretary of State is kind of in contact with people in Northern Ireland to varying degrees. But so this is why we included it in our assessment as one thing that could be considered. However, of course, it couldn't, the Secretary of State couldn't really say, well, I've been talking to such and such a group, I was on the streets in Derry or Londonderry, and I heard this, and now I've decided maybe a border poll would be a good idea. So it couldn't override other evidence, but and it would need to be transparent, but we've put it there as being significant. Next, please. Most people, and I get, again, media interest, is focus a lot on demographic data. When will there be a Catholic majority in Northern Ireland? The results of the 2021 census, the first ones will be published at the end of this month. We're not expecting the ones on religious identity, which everybody will be focusing on until autumn. Next slide, please. But this is why people are very interested. These are the results from the 2011 census, and the thing just to draw out from this is the rising proportion of the Catholic population, bearing in mind that Northern Ireland was designed to have a clear Protestant majority, and the Catholic population, when Northern Ireland was drawn, was a third. That top image there, this is taken from the Peace Monitoring Report of 2013, and I like the image because it shows you quite how much it's the younger population that we see, most particularly as the Catholic majority. And of course, as they grow older, we see significance there. Notably, too, how close it was. Now, this is religion brought up in. There is a difference. You can say what religion you still identify with. And from that religion identifying with, we see a rise in those who say they're of no religion. But taken religion brought up in, we see it was very close in the last one, 48% Protestant, 45% Catholic, and that rise of the Catholic population had gone up by 11 percentage points since 2001. So you see a very significant growth there. Hence the expectation there'll be a Catholic majority recorded in this next census. Next, please. I just want to mention a couple of things as a sociologist as to why we shouldn't run ahead of ourselves, in assuming this means a majority in favour of Irish unification. So using very crude green and orange images here, just to show, this is from the Life and Times survey. We see from this that it's not the case that when we ask, how would you vote in a border poll, it's not the case that every Catholic would vote in favour of Irish unification, or indeed that every Protestant would vote against it. And we indeed see here that almost 1 in 5 Catholics was saying they'd vote in favour of staying in the Union. However, just a little note here, the proportion of Catholics saying that they'd vote to stay in the Union has significantly declined since Brexit. And when we produce our next NILT findings at the end of this month, we'll see that's gone down further. So that is a moving issue, but I just to sort of say you can't, Catholic is not exactly the same as Irish nationalist. Next slide, please. And similarly too, in terms of self-identity as unionist or nationalist, a point I'm often making is quite how many Protestants, Catholics and others say they are neither unionist nor nationalist, and that has to have some significance. Next, please. The other issue, and this is very much to the fore, and that puts a lot of pressure on people like me who do surveys and opinion polling, how important will opinion polling be in judging whether there's a majority in favour of Irish unification? Next slide, please. So from the Life and Times survey, and I've been responsible for the political attitudes module of this for the last few years, we've consistently asked, what would you like the long-term policy for Northern Ireland to be? And you can see here the general trend since 1998. One thing just to note, Lisa mentioned the suspension of the institutions. You can see when those institutions were suspended from 2002 to 7, how much the support for Irish unification grows. So essentially when the devolved institutions are functioning, the push for Irish unification, or the desire for it, lessens somewhat, up until recently. Post-Brexit, post-protocol even, and the response to the protocol, you see a significant rise in people saying that they would like to see a united Ireland. I should say our findings from Northern Ireland Life and Times survey are often criticised for underrepresenting Sinn Féin voters, so you can be pretty sure this is a trend that is existing even now with the recent success of Sinn Féin. So you see there quite how much it's the case that Northern Ireland remaining in the UK and Northern Ireland becoming part of a united Ireland, those two things are becoming increasingly close. Next, please. And in terms of political identification, it's not quite the same, but to give a bit of context to this, so those who are neither unionist nor nationalist, that has been steadily rising since the Good Friday Agreement, with one or two exceptions. In 2018, those who are saying they're neither unionist nor nationalist were more than 50%. Post-Brexit, post-protocol, that's changing. So people are moving away from being neither unionist nor nationalist and moving more towards having one political identity or another. So it's having a polarizing effect. Next, please. Just on the limitations of opinion polling and surveys, of course, you've got a margin of error here, always, in every type of polling that you need to bear in mind, especially if you're looking for a majority of 50% plus one, you need to consider that. And we have the different types of polls, and if you thought unionist, nationalist differences are acute, you should look at the differences between those involved in different types of polling in Northern Ireland and quite how intense those debates and discussions and disputes are. I do a bit of both, and so I try and bridge the deep divides. But essentially, what we're talking about is recognizing that different types of polling can affect different results. Putting it very simply, it seems to be the case that online polling produces a greater number of people in favour of Irish unification compared to face-to-face polling, so-called shy nationalists. But essentially, if you take all of them, different types of polls, different types of surveys, you're more or less coming up with the same result, which is 50%, give or take, in favour of Northern Ireland staying in the Union. It's not sort of an overwhelming majority by any means. Also bearing in mind that a referendum campaign or expectation of referendum campaign may well change opinion as we lead up to that. Next, please. Then we come to the substance, which is more pertinent at the moment, votes cast in the elections. Next, please. And again, we can see the trends here. So these are different types of elections, but you can just, and I'm looking at first preference votes here, of course. You can see the success of the non-aligned in the European Parliament elections. That was Naomi Long, took the third seat alongside the DUP and Sinn Féin. She took it for Alliance Party. But you can see very clearly how in more recent times the differences between unionists and nationalists in first preference votes has been diminishing. Next, please. And in the most recent election, so in terms of first preference votes, 360,000 or so for unionist parties, 343,000 for nationalist. There are many problems with this, and in our working group on referendums on Irish unification, I pushed very strongly against the idea that votes cast in elections are an accurate indicator of support for Irish unification, not least because we have to have a right in Northern Ireland to be able to vote for parties on the basis of a wide range of policies, not just their position on a referendum. And we see there, and I've got the text there, and saying how it's not necessarily the case that people vote for parties, nationalist parties want to see Irish unification, and those voting for unionists do not. Different electoral systems, whether it's proportional representation or whether it's first past the post, there are different tactical responses from voters, often in relation to which party they do not want to see, as well as those they do. And of course, turnout makes a big difference as well. Next, please. And then we come to the question of seats won, because this, of course, makes up the assembly then. Does that tell us something significant about the desire for Irish unification? Next, please. And these are the two most recent elections, producing the seats that we currently have in Westminster, UK Parliament, and in the Northern Ireland Assembly. And you can see for yourselves, Nationalists hold the majority number of seats in Westminster, although notably, of course, Sinn Féin do not take them up. And then in the Northern Ireland Assembly, we have a very close holding of seats between Unionists and Nationalists. And you can see the success of the Alliance Party there in the most recent election shows a very significant third bloc. Next, please. And then last but not least, what about, and some people have been talking about this recently, what about if there's a vote in the Assembly? Perhaps Sinn Féin will do this. The Secretary of State surely could not ignore a situation in which the majority of people in the Assembly vote in favour of holding a border poll, even though that doesn't necessarily make it likely to happen. Next, please. There are several issues here. Would there be a need for cross-community consent? It's, of course, would be significant given the importance of the parties in shaping opinion in advance of a referendum. If there was such a vote in the Assembly, even if Unionists abstained, or even if it came close and didn't pass, what that would do for the political dynamics and debates in public around the prospects of Irish unity would be, of course, very significant. Of course, the Secretary of State is looking to see whether there is a majority likely to wish for United Ireland. He's not looking at elected representatives. He's meant to be looking at public opinion. Last slide, please. So to conclude, we do see that support for unionism and nationalism is becoming closer, and that the non-aligned bloc, which has been there for a long time, as we see, but it's now becoming politically significant. So we do have a fragile balance in Northern Ireland, but it's no longer between green and orange. There is now a third element to consider, even as those two become more equally balanced. So I would focus, to conclude, on the non-aligned. What they decide to do will largely depend on governments and parties and how they are reacting to this hugely constitutionally significant moment for the United Kingdom itself. And I'm thinking even of what's happening today, right? This moment in the formation of the Assembly, the MLAs come to take their seats. The DUP has said they will not nominate even a speaker to allow the Assembly to function. We know that the British government is pointing to uncertainty and insecurity as a justification for breaking international law. All of this is not, all of this has consequence, and in particular it has consequence for those who, even those who are undecided at the moment about the constitutional future of Northern Ireland, and what kind of future they would like for themselves and for their children. So, thank you.